October 29, 1974. I am talking to Pauline Millen on the subject of Iowa authors. Mrs. Millen has known many Iowa authors, knows the literary history of Iowa, and has dealt in Iowa books. Suppose we begin, Mrs. Millen, by you just telling me some of the things you've already been telling me about your association with Iowa literature and Iowa authors.
Well, my interest in Iowa literature goes back to, well, the beginnings. I've collected Iowa imprints, and while I don't have a large collection of them, I am interested in some of the early writers, just because I think it's of interest.
Would you explain that word, imprints?
Well, an imprint is a book printed in Iowa. Usually, the cutoff date is 1860. Anything prior to 1860. Although an Iowa imprint is any book printed in Iowa. But for professional collecting purposes, I say the cutoff date is usually 1860. Although many things after that are naturally very collectible. But according to some of the authorities, the first book written in Iowa was about 1856, which is 10 years after Iowa became a state. And there aren't too many copies of that around.
What was that book?
It was a book by a man named Hiram Reed, I believe, and it was printed in Davenport, and it was a book of poems called Heart's Ease. Again, I could be mistaken, but no, Harp. Well, he wrote a book called Harp of the West. The book printed in 1856 was Heart Lace. Heart Lace. Not very good, I understand. I've not read it, although I've seen copies. But the books that are more common and I think have a relevance to Iowa history are some of the books printed in Des Moines and are written by Des Moines writers around the 1870s. Such men as Tack Hussey, Leonard Brown, S.H.M. Byers. Again, most of these people were poets, but they did write other books. Leonard Brown wrote a fine unit history of Iowa volunteers in the Civil War called American Patriotism. But the book that he is very well known as a poet is his Poems of the Prairies. It's not impossible to find. There are quite a number of them around, and especially the best edition to my mind, which is the third edition. It has about a third to a half of it are notes about Brown's personal life, which was quite interesting, and about his social life, which reflects Des Moines history of the time.
Yes.
Again, Tack Hussey is very well known for his little book, a little history of Des Moines called Early Des Moines. But he wrote several books of poetry. One of them, probably the best known, called River Bend. And many of these are historical poems written on occasion of some celebration, 4th of July, or some event such as a train wreck or something of that kind. But the River Bend is illustrated with photographs of the Des Moines River. And so it shows what the Des Moines River looked, certain parts of the Des Moines River looked like in 1896, the year the book was published. Byers, again, was very prolific. Many books, poetry. One of his best known was The March to the Sea, which is Sherman's March to the Sea. And again, authorities say, while it's not terribly good poetry, it is a book written by a man who was took a very active part in the Civil War, and so that it has the feel that a soldier would have. One of Byers' scarcest books is his story of his imprisonment. It's called What I Saw in Dixie.
Oh.
And it's a scarce little book. His other books are fairly common.
We have another, excuse me, another prison book out of the Civil War, but from McKinley Cantor, don't we?
Yes, Andersonville.
Yeah.
And Long Remember both.
Oh, of course.
Are both Civil War background.
That's interesting. The two books of different times.
That's right. Of course, Mac Cantor had a great interest in the Civil War. He told about sitting around in Webster City and sitting around listening to the veterans, the old soldiers, telling stories of the Civil War. And this was he was a buff, you might say, on Civil War.
Yes.
And so I think that's one of the reasons, it seems to me, that his books on the Civil War are his better books.
Yes.
For instance, I don't care for Spirit Lake at all.
I never was able to finish it.
I didn't. I think I've heard many people comment, and that was my reaction also. I just didn't. I like his Chicago stories.
Oh, yes.
Jaybird, and his somewhat biographical books, autobiographical. He's an interesting writer, but Spirit Lake, for some reason,
was too much.
Too much. That's right.
I don't know why Floyd Dell popped into my mind a moment ago, and I don't know why. Of course, he left. He was one of those you were talking about that left Iowa, didn't he?
He did, and although he was very popular, of course, at the period that he first started writing, which I believe was in the late 20s, early 30s, Mooncalf was one of the first. He does have an autobiography.
Was that so?
Which I haven't read. I haven't, but I haven't read it, and I must do so because I think it probably would give at least part of it should give his story of his early life in Iowa, so that
he was from Davenport, wasn't he?
I believe so. Because I know that one of the writers comments about Susan Glaspell and George Cram Cook and Floyd Dell's association.
Yes.
And I can't remember the name of his autobiography, but I would like to find it just so that we can have it on
I didn't know about an autobiography.
Homecoming.
Oh.
Homecoming is the name of it.
Well, I wonder if we have that in the library here.
Mooncalf was 1920. I'm surprised it was that early.
Yes,
and Homecoming was a little later. I don't have the date of that, but those are the two that I remember, the Mooncalf and Homecoming. But he was part of that Davenport group. Of the early 90s, early 1900s.
The other day I mentioned to someone the name of Susan Glaspell. This was Iowa people, and they'd never heard of her. That shocked me. And I said she won the Pulitzer Prize. Was I right? Did she ever win the Pulitzer Prize? I got to thinking about it after I said it. It seemed to me
I don't think I can answer that. She might have won it for a play. You know, she did a number of plays.
Yes.
And I don't remember though that of course she was very active in the theater, and I don't know. She she went to Drake University.
What was that? I didn't know that. No.
And I know they're very much interested in her at Drake, and of course for that reason.
Yes.
But she was in Drake in 1897, and then worked on the Des Moines paper, Des Moines News. But we went back to Davenport, and after she was married, went east, and that was her theater work. But I don't know about the prize.
I should have looked that up before I asked the question, or before I made that positive statement the other day about it. Then we were talking the other day about octave-thanet.
Yes, again, she has never been one of my favorites, and so while I know something of her books, I've just never, I haven't read very many of them because she had a great success as a magazine writer, you know, and her books sold very well.
Yes.
But from a literary style, I think she was rather dull, and so one wonders why she sold so well. But she she again reflects the life of the times.
Yes, that was it. At the time she was writing, she wrote about what people believed in. Mm-hmm. Today she's thought to be, that biography of her is called Journey to Obscurity. Took her to task so severely, you know, for being such a right-winger. But heavens, she was writing in the days before we ever distinguished right wing from left wing.
That's true, and I remember in that book how interesting it was that someone who had been reared in an atmosphere of comparatively affluence, but wrote about some of these everyday things and you might say lower class labor novels that had a labor background and all. And of course, as you say, she usually reflected her background in her way that she approached the problems. Also, the same book speaks about her novels that dealt with prison system in Arkansas where she lived, you know, part of the time, and the relationships between black and white, the black people and white people, and so again, they very definitely probably should be read by anyone who wants to read Iowa novels that reflect the period, and but she really. That biography of hers is really worth reading.
Oh yes.
Just to it's a good book, and it's and to see if one can understand what makes a literary bestseller. You might say.
We're talking not about my reminiscences, but I remember when I was a cub reporter being taken by someone to meet Miss Alice French, and they said, "Oh, you will like her. Maybe you've heard of her," and I wasn't sure. And they said, "Well, she wrote books under the name of octave-thanet." And so, of course, I knew that name. I was thrilled, you know. By that time, she was quite old. And I think she had only one leg at that time, didn't she? Didn't she have a leg removed from...
Yes, she did have. Yeah.
But I was, as I say, youngster and tremendously impressed by meeting a great name, as I thought, and she had read some of my feature articles in the Rock Island Argus, and she started out and saying, "Oh, I've read some of your things, and they are just splendid."
Oh, nice.
And I don't remember what I said after that. That's all I remember of it. But I've always treasured her. Wasn't that gracious of her too?
Very much so.
And so I've always loved her ever since then.
Well, I think I would too under the circumstances. You know, a writer that I'm always surprised to see classified as an Iowa writer. And of course, there's so many different standards as to who are and who are not Iowa writers. But Hamlin Garland, to me, is not an Iowa writer, although I've collected some of his things because I find him classified that way. He did write about Iowa and Iowa farm life, but as I remember, he was born in Wisconsin, and he quite a number of his things have a South Dakota background, if I'm not mistaken. So, but he was again one of the luminaries, you might say, one of the great writers, nationally known at least, of the early period.
Yes.
But I've not read much of Hamlin Garland or Herbert Quick, some of Emerson Hough. My reading really developed along about the time that I was of Iowa writers. I of course been reading from the time before I went to school, but the Iowa writers that I remember enjoying the most were the ones who were writing at the time that I became interested in books in the
Yes.
20s, in the late teens and 20s, such as Ruth Suko, who is one of our great writers,
Yes.
as far as I'm concerned. I think she makes the small town life of Iowa vivid, and she, according to what I have seen of Iowa small town life and the people that I know who have lived in small towns, she is so factually correct, and yet she does it in a rather subtle way. She brings
Yes.
out these facts, and then her nature background, the nature lore is so interesting, and this of course reflects her own interest in nature. One of her family stories is how she and my husband's mother took walks together, and my mother-in-law was almost a professional botanist. She was so skilled and well versed, and she found Rusuko, who knew just as much as she did.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, she kept bees in this little town of Earlville in eastern Iowa.
Ruth Suko did?
Ruth Suko did. And she lived for a time by herself in a little house on the edge of town there, and was doing some of her writing at the time. And her, I think I commented to you, the things I liked best were excerpts from her journals published in the Iowa Magazine that have not been published in book form, as far as I know. I may be wrong about that, but I haven't been able to find them. But and of course, another writer that same period is Phil Stong, who is so close to Iowa, and went to Drake, worked in Des Moines.
Yes.
And has written so many novels and juveniles about Iowa life, particularly Iowa farm life, and his history of Iowa, the Hawkeyes, is most enjoyable reading because he writes history with a little chuckle, as anyone who knew Phil Stong would know. He was always interested in people, and especially in how strange everyone was. And, the humor of man's life, you might say. I just recently bought a limited autographed edition of Buckskin Breeches from my own collection, and I was quite surprised to see that Clarence Andrews considers it one of the better novels of Indian life in Iowa. Now, so I'll have to read it now. I've read most of Stone, but I have not to have read that one, and so I must read it and see what how he did approach the early Indian life in Iowa.
I liked The Long Lane. Do you know that?
Yes. Well, of course, State Fair, of course, has always been one of my favorites.
Of course.
And because it was a picture of something I knew very well. My husband covered State Fair. Maybe for the record, I should say that the reporter in State Fair is supposed to be based partially on Cliff and partially on another reporter on the paper. So it was always sort of a sentimental interest.
We should mention that Cliff, of course, was your husband.
Yes, the writer for the Des Moines Register and Tribune. But Stong is a great favorite. I find many people coming in wanting his books because they're so readable. And just recently, a person who has a critical mind spoke of him again as a nature writer, of how he reflected the background, the natural life of Iowa, and compared it actually with Paul Ingle, with this portrait of Iowa,
yes.
and which I hadn't thought about doing.
That is interesting.
And of course, come up to contemporary. Paul Ingle is another person that is being more and more collected, which is from one of the ways I view a writer.
Of course.
And especially when a writer of our own time, when people start collecting him, I feel that it's because they like the things he writes. I mean, it's not because an artificial value has been set up of scarcity or something of that kind, although some of his early things are fairly scarce.
Yes.
But I've enjoyed the things of Ingles that I have read, particularly the early American Songs, American Child, some of the earlier things. I still have not read his novel, and I ought to do it one of these days.
Yes, I don't know the novel.
Right at the moment, I don't remember the title of it. It has something to do with the earth, which so much of his work, let's see, More on Earth, his poems, Always the Land, I believe maybe Always the Land is the novel.
I don't remember it.
Always the Land is the novel. It's the one novel that Always the Land.
Yes.
As you see, so many of his titles do reflect the natural history background, the land, the War on Earth, Corn. Corn is one of the early ones. It's a little scarce, and Always the Land. And so naturally, it was very natural then for this person to compare Phil Stong's,
of course,
the background of the farm and natural history background of Phil Stong with Ingle.
Yes.
I hadn't thought about it before until you made that comment.
Yes. Then you mentioned we were talking a while ago about authors that aren't thought of as Iowa authors, and you mentioned Carl Van Vechten.
Oh yes. Well, of course, Carl Van Vechten always had this air of sophistication about. Well, he was a sophisticated man, and so that especially for the young person in the 20s, 30s, he was one of the prime favorites, and I don't think Van Vechten ever wrote anything about Iowa.
How about the Tattooed Countess? Wasn't I? No, I may be wrong, but I thought that the people was it Cedar Rapids?
I believe you're right.
Were rather.
And I read the Tattooed Countess way back when.
Well, yes.
But I forgot.
But the people of Cedar Rapids were a little offended by it,
yes,
as I recall.
That is right. Parts of it, I think it was in and out of Cedar Rapids.
Yes.
So, but the ones that I remember best were his novels of New York life, such as Clear Heaven, and things, because this was an interesting and very strange to Middle Western person at the time, and a way quite a bit. He was early in his interest in this thing. It may have been an upper class person looking at this life, but it was not really that. I think he really had a sympathetic interest, a simpatico for the black, especially when it came to because of the music. Yes. Because again, this was one of Van Vechten's great interests with music.
Yes. As a matter of fact, he was a music critic in New York, wasn't he?
That's right. Yes, and one of his books, Firecrackers, I believe is the title, is a collection of his criticisms. And but he was. It's too bad in a way that he didn't do more. He didn't stay in Cedar Rapids and write more of Iowa, but it just was not.
Still was a distinguished career.
That's right. Yes, I'm looking at Andrews now, and Andrews, The Tattoo Countess, was set in Maple Valley, Iowa.
Ah, yes.
And Cedar Rapids readers had no trouble in identifying Maple Valley sites with Cedar Rapids sites. So we did have that one book in which the Countess returned to Cedar Rapids or Maple Valley.
Yes. You mentioned Andrews. Perhaps we should identify Andrews.
Clarence Andrews, Clarence A. Andrews, has written a literary history of Iowa,
yes,
which was published by the University of Iowa Press in 1972. And he really covers the field of Iowa writers in a very generous way. Little biography, very little criticism. He usually quotes other critics, both for and against the writer, and he lists most of their works, so that it's a very good history. And he classifies the writers, a little mixed type bouquet, you might say. He gives certain chapters to one writer. He will cover the whole field of that writer. Then he will have another chapter which is a general background, like the farmer in the dell, or prairie riders, or that kind of thing, and then he just throws into that chapter many different ones. I find it a little disconcerting, the arrangement, but
yes,
it's there's a good index, and so one can usually find fairly quickly
yes,
what one wants. It's one of several books that are very good reference books on Iowa writers. Another one, which is more of a bibliography, actually is called a biobibliography, because short sketch of the life of each writer before the bibliographic sightings, and that is Frank Paluka's book Iowa Authors, which was also published in Iowa City in 1967. Frank Paluka is the head of the Special Collections Department at the University of Iowa Library, and so has facilities for this kind of thing.
Yes.
Then there are many others. An older one that has some critics is Marple's Iowa Authors and Their Works, which has so much in it that many people criticize it, saying that it has things in it that should not be in. I mean, but it was made up by one of the librarians in our historical library and published in Des Moines in 1918, and by Alice Marple, who was an assistant in the department at that time. And so it's very good just because of so many sightings. And then there are any number of other things that one can use, that most of our libraries have or can get for one.
Yes.
But those are the three that I use a great deal and find very valuable.
That's good to know.
Now, one of the things that we talked about, those early Iowa poets, we haven't talked very much, with the exception of we mentioned Paul Engel, but we haven't talked about several other poets who are writing today. Well, I'll go back. One that we missed that was in between the 1870 period and today was Arthur Davison Fickey, who was part of that Davenport group.
Yes.
And again, was nationally recognized.
Yes.
Not only for his poetry, but for his art interest, his interest in art and some of his writings on the subject. But I think that one should never leave him out of a list of Iowa poets. J. Sigmund, James Hurst, our Raymond Krusensky are three that come to mind. Raymond Krusensky is dead, of course, and I believe J. Sigmund is too, but their books were published in the last 25 years. And James Hurst, to me, is one of the better Iowa poets. Again, writing about Iowa farm life, and having been published in poetry, many other magazines, literary magazines such as Midland, and a number of his things were published by the Prairie Press, which was first at Muscatine and then at Iowa City, Carroll Coleman's press. So they're collectible from the standpoint of a good Iowa poet and also from a fine Iowa press. And speaking of Iowa presses, we had two in Des Moines, but one in particular that I'm thinking about, which had a very short life, but the Maisland Press, which published Tom Duncan and J. Sigmund and several other writers, but those are the two best known.
Maisland?
Corn, maize, you know.
Of course, yes.
And it was a group of Iowa men, or Des Moines men, Des Moines residents, who decided that we needed a publisher of Iowa things. What they were doing were encouraging young writers. And the book of Tom's that they published was one of his early books of poetry, and published, I think, when he was living in Des Moines.
Where does he live now?
New Mexico.
Yes.
After leaving Des Moines, he lived various places in the Middle West, mostly because of his health. He lived in the Taos area. Then he lived in Apple Valley in the Mojave Desert, the little town in the Mojave Desert, you know. And just a few years ago, sold his home there. He and his wife, who you may know as Actia Young, who was a Des Moines woman who wrote mystery stories under the name Carolyn Thomas. And they are living in a mobile home near Lordsburg, New Mexico. And of course, Tom is best known for his Gus the Great. Which a novel of circus life of a circus that was based at Granger, Iowa, and so it not only was an Iowa writer, but it was about an Iowa-based circus. And he wrote another book about circuses, Ring Horse, and had a great interest in circuses. But one of his books that I enjoyed the most was not an Iowa book, but it was a book about the Middle West, the Mississippi River Valley, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Big River, Big Man. But it also was about the Southwest, which he knew a lot because of having lived there. And one of the qualities of Tom's book that I know about in various ways, which I won't go into detail about, was the research he did. Of course, all good writers do a great deal of research on their books. But I've just been fascinated by the research that went into Big River, Big Man. And then he is supposed to be really working on a trilogy, I believe it's to be, again about an Iowa family and the labyrinth, which, of course, the background is Casey, Iowa, is part of that.
He is working on that now?
Well, that's my understanding. His last book, which I do not have, is this book about an early flyer. Do you know the name of that? An Iowa man, an evader of the very early period. And I know that he had done a great deal of research on it and had quite a bit of material on it, so he probably put it together or maybe just did a final refurbishing of it and published it. But my understanding that he was working on on more of this family who he dealt with in The Labyrinth, which was the last novel. Yes. I have had letters from him and I know his health is very poor at the present time, so just how much work he's able to do, I'm not sure about.
Yes. Was A.B. Guthrie an Iowa author?
I don't think so. I'm just quite sure. I'm surprised sometimes to find out who are and who are not Iowa writers. Wallace Stegner, for instance.
That was a surprise to me.
It was a surprise to me because when you mentioned Guthrie, it made me think of Stegner because they both have written so much of the West. And but I'm just quite sure that Guthrie is not. I think Stegner is one of our better writers.
Oh, a major writer, no doubt about that.
His biography of Bernard DeVoto is a masterpiece, it seems to me.
Yes, it can rightly be called a masterpiece, I do believe.
I thought I knew quite a bit about DeVoto until I read that, and I discovered I didn't know a thing about him. But it made him a much more interesting person than the kind of person that I had visualized from reading his things. And also, I enjoyed Stegner's novel Angle of Repose very much, and so I'm awaiting.
It was a great critical success.
Yes,
certainly.
well, it was a most interesting thing.
Now, how about let's see, have we got up to the present yet?
Well,
current
in talking
new authors.
I don't know too many of the newer writers. I'm sorry to say, I've quit reading fiction to a great degree,
yes.
and so that it's just occasionally, such as something like Stegner's, that I just because it had a historical background, I think, and a literary background to some extent, I picked it up and read it and discovered I liked Stegner much better than I thought I might. And so I've been reading some of his earlier novels.
Yes.
But some of the writers who are that one hears mentioned often, like Curtis Hartnack, for instance, who just received an award from the Iowa Library Association. I haven't read a thing of his, and I intend to because I feel I should. But there's quite a number of them, and a number of others of ones who are not new, such as Manfred, for instance, Fikema, who's who should probably not miss. I've not read a single novel of his or a single book. I don't know whether he's written anything but novels. But there are, I will admit, gaps in my reading, and because occasionally I'll read an Iowa writer just to find out what he's all about.
Yes.
But most of reading of that kind is just for pleasure, and so it's been a sort of hit and miss affair.
Yes. And, of course, to mention all the Iowa authors would take us hours, and
Richard Bissell, for instance, is another. I have read. I was at school in Dubuque, and Dubuque can be a fascinating town from the historical standpoint, and because I was at school there for a couple of years and lived in Dubuque, you might say. So I read most of Bissell.
Yes.
And it's fairly light, but entertaining.
And tremendously entertaining.
And so and again. Some good background of the River City. And speaking of River City, gets us to Meredith.
Of course.
And
Meredith Wilson.
Yes, Meredith Wilson. I had to stop and think Meredith Nicholson, Meredith Wilson, whom, again, I've read. Not all, but some of his things.
Yes.
And,
Mm-hmm.
But there's another writer that I was trying to, James Norman Hall.
Oh, yes, of course.
And by the way, there's a little interesting, you ask about the talking about books from the rare book standpoint. One of the interesting things about James Norman Hall is that he wrote a little book under the pseudonym of Fern Gravel called O'Millersville, which is probably about Colfax.
Oh.
And many people don't know it. I believe it also was published by Prairie Press, but many people don't know that that's one of James Norman Hall's books.
Yes.
Right? A slight one, but probably has a little to do with Colfax.
Yes.
And, another writer that one that is worth reading is Charles Edward Russell of Davenport, who wrote some Mississippi books about the Mississippi River. And I noticed that his son John Russell has written many books, and I haven't read a single one. So, and whether any of them have to do with Iowa, I don't know, because I just haven't read them. Another Josephine Herbst.
Oh, yes.
Margaret Wilson, your women writers. Elspeth Thane, who, of course, is still writing, and has written some very good historical novels. And I have read a number of her things. And, of course, she was lived in Des Moines for quite a while, which makes her a little closer when it's a Des Moines writer as well as an Iowa writer.
Yes.
And but there's several others. You were speaking of contemporary, a Esther Warner, who has written a number of things, whom I don't know at all. Lloyd Heberly. Do you know his things?
Only that name.
And James Stevens, of course, Paul Bunyan things. Now, speaking of Guthrie and Stegner, I didn't have the least idea that James Stevens was an Iowa writer. But he was born in Iowa, and the Bunyan things are a little away from us, but we had a lot of logging along the Mississippi River, you know.
Yes.
So we probably should think of Stevens as reflecting a certain part of Iowa life. Did we talk about Bess Streeter Aldrich?
No,
we just mentioned her in passing.
I just noticed that name. Yeah.
Now she is. I really feel that I have to confess this. I have never read Land in Her Hand. I know all the titles, but I have not read any of Bess Streeter Aldrich, and I'm sure she's worth reading.
Oh yeah.
So one of these days I'm going to have to go to the bookshelves and pick out her books and start reading them. But I wonder, well, what will I read next? And Honoré Mauro.
Yeah, oh yes.
Yes. Her again historical fiction. She considered one of the best.
Yes.
So
yes.
We, of course, could go on forever. Emerson Huff, we just barely mentioned.
Oh, yes.
Had great critical success.
The Covered Wagon.
Covered Wagon.
Yes.
And Mississippi Bubble, which I did read because I've always thought that was an interesting episode. Then he did a number. He's, of course, very well known for his books on the West.
Yes.
And very much collected because some of his things were illustrated by such people as Frederick Remington. And
Oh, was that so? Very interesting.
The story of the cowboy has Charles Russell illustrations, and the story of the outlaw, and Way West, Young Alaskans, Passing of the Frontier, which is a good chronicle of the West,
yes.
a good nonfiction. North of 36, all kinds of historical novels
yes.
that have good background. There's someone else of that same. Ellis Parker Butler.
Heavens, yes. I don't think I knew he was an Iowa author.
Yes, he is another river, Muscatine.
Ah, yes.
It was his hometown.
Uh-huh.
And, of course, most of his things are humor.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But
pigs is pigs.
Pigs is pigs, and the water goats. Goat feathers is one that people ask about when they're collecting him. He was quite a prolific writer, and did a few things that were serious or nonfiction. But I've read so little of them. I've handled a few of them, but have not read very many. But he had a national reputation.
Oh, yes.
He was published in magazines, and so we certainly should not leave him out. And Paul Corey has an excellent gives an excellent picture of Iowa life in his novels. Another person who mostly nonfiction, but did at least one novel, was Marcus Childs, whom we know better as a political columnist.
Yes.
But he wrote one novel. I've forgotten the title of it. The Cabin. The Cabin was the name of it.
Mm-hmm.
Which I believe had some Iowa background. But most of these things were written about his main interest, which was the national and international
political thing. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, we're coming close to the end of our tape, but it's obvious that we could go on for many, many thousands of feet of tape talking about Iowa authors. Thank you so much, Mrs. Millen, Mrs. Pauline Millen, for talking about Iowa authors. I'm sure that this tape is going to be a treasure trove for students in the future who are researching Iowa authors. Thank you.